Good morning, everybody. By my reckoning, we should be kicking off at past, and I think we're about 3 minutes past that, so it might be appropriate to get going. Are there still lots of people outside? No, everyone's here. Okay, great. So, good morning, hello, thanks for coming back. I really enjoyed yesterday's session, actually, and I hope you did too. And apologies for the interruption halfway through; it was beyond my control. If it happens again, it's still beyond my control. So we'll just proceed. So the first thing I discovered is I'd misspelled resilience, but there it is, and it's not correctly spelled, I think. Is it still wrong? Is it double L or one? Oh, I could never spell. Okay. So I'm in the commerce faculty, not in the English faculty. So, just to kind of re-familiarize ourselves with where we were, how many people weren't at yesterday's session? Weren't. So I knew. Okay. All right. So I'll just quickly tell you what this is about. This was kind of encapsulated at the back end of the book, and it really talks about the mindset of the artist and the disciplines of the artist. To go back even further, what I try to do as somebody passionate about music, I was a DJ on UCT radio for about 5 years, and it was like heaven going into that. That it was like a wine. I have a wine cellar now, but there was a record cellar, and there were just thousands of albums which you could never afford as a student, and there they were, and you could just hold them and play them to people who loved that music, and we were just like this little cult that just thrived on music, and it became, we kind of imprinted on it, actually. It's what kittens do with their mothers. But that's what happened to me. It was a wonderful experience. And so then I read up feverishly around that. I remember reading No Direction Home, which was the biography by Robert Shelton on Bob Dylan at the time. It came out in about 1988. And for me, it was definitive. And then there are obviously subsequent accounts. And just incredible to read about this guy that you were listening to. At the same time, I was also writing a bit of poetry, which is, you know, when you're young, and I was in the grips of what they call unrequited love. So the muse visited me regularly. And the result of which is that I just got into these artists, and it was fantastic. So then all these books started emerging. Dylan wrote his own story, Chronicles Volume 2. If you can get hold of it, it's a wonderfully, beautifully written book. And then, as I said, there were other books by writers writing up the stories of people who had subsequently died, guys like Jimi Hendrix, for example. And then books by artists who were still alive, and in fact shouldn't be, like Keith Richards. He for those of you who don't know, he's lead guitarist for the Rolling Stones, and took a substantial amount of drugs during the 70s especially, to the extent that when he wrote the biography, he said most of the book is about the 60s and the 70s. I honestly can't remember much of it. And there's a very good reason for that, because his brain had kind of dislocated. But it's an amazing thing, you know. He's a happily married guy now living in New York, and he's got 2 daughters, one of which is engaged to a Stellenbosch boykie, and who's the son of a guy called Andre Nudier, who I got to know at the book launch. So through Andre and Andre's son and Andre's now fiance, the book has now got to Keith Richards. Whether, in fact, he gets to read it, I'm not quite sure. Although a mate of mine, Theo Kraus, is the lead guitarist for a band called the Springbok Nude Girls, met up with the fiancé and the daughter and encouraged them to read it again, or to try and engage with it. So let's see if Keith actually gets it. But if he does, then, you know, you might hear of Bob Dylan and other people getting to read it. Doesn't matter. But anyway, so that's just by way of background. So all of these books have been the most amazing piece of insight. And then just to be in this particular time where everything is on the internet, including videos, wonderful accounts taken from, you know, David Bowie was highly articulate about his life and his struggles. And there he is in full flesh on BBC or on Charlie Watts. I don't know what that, I think it's a CNN program. So these guys are giving an account, and very few people have actually said, well, if we spool all this stuff together, maybe we can get in aggregate something that is sensible. And as an academic, but also as somebody who's passionate about this thing, and there's that word, there it is, passion. It's been wonderful to try and understand what this thing about artistry is about, because I really believe, well, certainly in the academic literature, it's a black box. We don't understand how creativity happens. I think that's why this talk is seemingly quite popular, because people are fascinated by it, and there are no definitive accounts of how the whole thing works. There are some people who talk about how that stuff happens there, but they don't know enough about the mindset issues. And maybe not all these disciplines have been put together, and maybe there are others. But as I read through these accounts, these were the kind of themes that percolated out of what I was reading. And then eventually I managed to staple it all together, and I thought, well, maybe that's what it looks like. But as you'll see, let's see if this works. Here you go. As you'll see, it gets even more complicated. So as I've looked at it further, the mindset issues are still relevant. So there's suffering, which we spoke about yesterday. There's love, which I call passion, which I'll allude to. And there's resilience, which is the topic of today. Is it correctly spelled this time? Thank you. And so, and then what happens is that in childhood, there's a lot of this stuff that goes on, which is really related to, I think, Jung's analysis of early childhood and separation and shadow issues. So we spoke at some length about that. There was a comment made at the time that said a lot of people produce art that isn't necessarily related to suffering. In fact, there are happy artists. So my only response to that was that there might well be, and in other areas where creative work applies, and I'm talking about sport here, that you don't necessarily have to suffer. You might just start off with love. So you might just begin on that section over there. But I was watching a clip of Paul McCartney last night, and there he is. He's like 70, and he's playing with a guy called David Grohl from the Foo Fighters, and he started out as the drummer for a band called Nirvana, which was very big in the 90s, and their lead singer, Kurt Cobain, killed himself in the early 90s. But anyway, so there's David Grohl and Paul McCartney. And Paul McCartney, as you know, was the kind of like the sunshine face of the Beatles. But at the same time, he says that the more crises that you have, the better you write. So I'm not 100% convinced that unhappiness, that you have to be a miserable person to produce art. But I think that what he said is that the more crises you have, the more you can tap into that stuff. Maybe we can have a conversation about that later. But anyway, there's the suffering part that occurs. And then this early stuff about how you imprint, I think, is really important. And then you just commit to this thing because you just love it. And that, for me, was music. It's somehow just scripted through who I am. So today we're going to talk about resilience. And the resilience is the stuff that we need in order to break through, to push into the art, the craft, the discipline, to become, I don't mean it to be a sexist term, I don't know what the neutral version is, but to become a master at what you're doing. So in so doing, you need a lot of these other disciplines like persistence and proactivity. And as you become better and better, you can apply this thing called perspective, which I think is probably innate, but you can develop it as you go along. And that perspective, did I say persistence? That perspective is about improvising, observation skills, and the like. And we could have a conversation about that. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end of this time. So this practice issue becomes the 10,000 hour rule. And the more you do it, the more unconscious it becomes. And the analogy that I've used in the book, it's a bit like driving a car. Remember when you first started? Daniel Kahneman talks about system 1 and 2. And system 1 is that you just totally focused on this task. And eventually it becomes increasingly unconscious. And then you can start doing your makeup and drinking your coffee and taking multiple phone calls and doing what you typically do in the car. And at the same time, driving the car. And that becomes an unconscious part of it. But if a dog suddenly goes through, you're able to get back into system 1 and focus on what you're doing. But it becomes an unconscious thing. And that unconscious part is really critical to becoming a great artist, because there are unconscious dynamics and flows that start occurring. And particularly in jazz, and guys like Bill Evans spoke a lot about that. And that unconscious part is about more like being rather than doing. And then this is part of this thing which we call setting the table, which is just arriving, going through the yards, pitching, making sure it happens, that you've done a due diligence. And if you're lucky, then something will happen. And I call it serendipity. And a lot of people say it's a divine thing. It's the muse. The Greeks spoke about it. And I'll show you some quotes at the end of this, that they all talk about this thing that David Crosby says, I had no control of my pen, of what came out of it. It just happened. So it's not a super religious thing, but it's something where you're just not in control anymore. We don't understand that enough, but that's kind of what the story is. So this is like the big picture of how it all looks. And as I said, I was invited to talk about this thing of suffering and this thing of resilience. And you can see they're not totally related. But if you get the big picture, you can see somehow how it kind of stitches together. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. And I'll kind of kick off now with the rest of the session. Let's see what happens. But I wanted to come back to what I was talking about yesterday, which was this issue of the outsider. And I remember I said to you, I'm running out of time and I want to leave a couple of slides behind, and I'll try and pick it up. So I just wanted to come back to this thing about the insider and the outsider. And I don't know if you remember, I spoke about Bob Dylan and how he said that when he started out, you know, the insiders were Perry Como and Frank Sinatra and the Sound of Music. And it hasn't changed. And he still feels like an outsider. This being the statesman of the folk songwriter movement, got a Nobel Prize. And he still feels like an outsider. So for me, it's about insiders and outsiders, and how, because the big question then is, how do we as privileged people, some of us being insiders, how do we promote art, which includes the outsiders? How do we bring them into the tent? Do we bring them into the tent, or do they loiter on the periphery? What are our responsibilities in this respect? And I was really moved when I saw this picture of the street children in Bangladesh, and they're everywhere. They're in this country. They're around the block. But I wanted to read you this particular quote, and this comes from J.K. Rowling, she was invited in 2008 to give the commencement address at Harvard. And she said this. Now, let's just back up. She said to the graduates coming out of Harvard, you cannot get more privileged than these kids that are about to embark on glittering careers. They are so set up. So she's challenging them to think about the outsider, because these kids are going to be insiders and they're going to run the status quo for their generation. So this is what she says to them. She says, many prefer not to exercise their imaginations at all. They choose to remain comfortably within the bounds of their own experience, never troubling to wonder how it would feel to have been born other than who they are. They can refuse to hear screams or to peer inside cages. They can close their minds and hearts to any suffering that does not touch them personally. But they can refuse to know. I might be tempted to envy people who can live that way, except that I do not think they have any fewer nightmares than I do. Choosing to live in narrow spaces can lead to a form of mental agoraphobia that brings its own terrors. I think the willfully unimaginative see more monsters, and they are often more afraid. What is more, those who choose not to empathize may enable real monsters. For without ever committing an act of outright evil ourselves, we collude with it through our own apathy. If you choose to use your status and influence to raise your voice on behalf of those who have no voice, if you choose to identify not only with the powerful but with the powerless, if you retain the ability to imagine yourself into the lives of those who do not have your advantages, then it will not only be your proud families who celebrate your existence, but thousands and millions of people whose reality you have helped transform for the better. We do not need magic to change the world. We carry all the power we need inside ourselves already. We have the power to imagine better. And J.K. Rowling is an amazing story in her own right. But you can see that she really decided to speak out and to challenge, because she spoke from, we see outsiders as artists, but outsiders are everywhere. They are the marginalized in society, full stop. And the responsibility is to integrate on all levels. And I'm not sure how much of that actually hit home, but into that particular target. But certainly it hit home for me. So I just thought I'd bring that to your attention. But I'm going to move on to grit now. So grit is the term that I use for resilience, however you spell it. And the wonderful thing is it comes from a book. Although it's become such a sexy term, the real book comes from Charles Portis, called True Grit. And it's set in the 1870s, and it's got this naive little girl called Maddie Ross, and she's 14 years old. And it's amazing that Charles Portis gives her this kind of stern, Sunday school ethic-driven preacherliness that comes through, because somebody kills Maddie Ross's father, and she decides that she's going to go out and find this killer. And so she has to choose who's going to do it. And she needs a U.S. Marshal, because the killers have gone out into land where U.S. law does not preside. And so she finds somebody who recommends her, and eventually she chooses this guy called Rooster Cogburn. And she decides on him because he's a pitiless man who's double tough. And although Rooster has his own weaknesses, he loves, as the writer puts it, he loves to pull the cork. And he lives like a goat, a billy goat, in this rather kind of craven existence in the back of a Chinese supermarket store. At the same time, he has this internal quality, which is, damn the torpedoes. I'm going to go out there and do what is required. And that's what grit is about. So For me, reading that book was really wonderful. So here's some other quotes by people who've spoken about this issue of resilience and grit. George Bernard Shaw: the reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable man persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. Henry Matisse said that creativity takes courage. That is what we've got to do. David Bowie: to be a guerrilla, to be on your own, is far more rewarding in the end if you have the determination to carry it through. Raymond McIntyre: what an amazing artist. One's only chance is to be oneself. And that requires a hell of a lot of internal courage to step out and to be who you are. For the record, Raymond McIntyre is a New Zealand portraitist who did most of his work in London in the early part of the last century. And I saw this portrait in Auckland during the 2011 Rugby World Cup year. And I was really moved to see how this guy operated. And I bought his biography and read up about him. And he was fully driven about this whole project around authenticity, which artists get automatically. And Willem de Kooning, the modernist, so talking about how you've got to go out there and do what you've got to do if you're going to be true. Every so often a painter has to destroy a painting. Cezanne did it, Picasso did it with Cubism, then Pollock did it. He busted our idea of a picture all to hell. Then there could be new paintings again. So it's this question of doing what you've got to do because this is what has to happen. So I'm going to talk about 3 forms of grit now. So you get a sense of the dimensions of how this thing looks. And this is just my own analysis of how I looked at things. But the first one is the requirement of starting out, which is you're a failure and now you have to succeed. Or let's just say you've never tried, but you've got to now push through. So in the face of huge odds, how are you going to find expression? How are you going to, I hate that word, but I'll use it, how are you going to find traction in the market? All right? So it's all about that kind of stuff. The next one is artistic integrity, and that is about this project of trying to be true to yourself, finding your internal compass and staying on course. And the other one, which I thought was remarkable, was this question of moral courage versus the pull of state and also of capital, actually. And how do you align yourself with what you need to do rather than what other forces are expecting or baiting you to do. So let's look at determination versus failure. I alluded to this yesterday, but that in general, there seems to be a healthy part of artists that they can be sufficiently strong with their ego to push through, because my goodness, you've got to have a lot of persistence to do it. All right. So Kay Jamison says that they're psychologically sicker in that they score higher on a variety of measures of psychopathology, but on another level, they're healthier because of the self-confidence and ego strength that they have. And Daniel Kahneman, another Nobel Prize winner, speaks about the super confidence that a lot of entrepreneurs have as well when they take their ideas to market, and they have to have it, because I don't want to overemphasize it, but 95% of all business startups will not make it, and that's the truth of it. And it's just the rule of nature drawn out in tooth and claw. And that's how it is. So in order to make it, you've got to believe in what you're doing. And I'll talk a little bit about that later as well. So I'm going to give you some examples of how, from my own readings, of how these guys managed to push through. So Leonard Cohen Age 71. His partner / girlfriend / whatever wipes him out financially. He discovers that his life earnings have been taken out. He's left with $150,000. And so he's now forced to tour as an old bullet, doing a dog and pony show around the world to try and recoup his losses. And I don't know if you've seen those concerts that he did. There's a wonderful one at the O2 Arena in London. But he is just such a quintessential, highly evolved man, a gentleman. And when you see him delivering it, the whole audience just like gravitates towards him because of who he intrinsically is. So he died just the other day, of course. The wonderful story of Becker and Fagen, Donald Fagen and Walter Becker, who, of course, the late Walter Becker, he died also last year. They're all dying. This is the reality, that these artists are telling their stories and are signing off, really. So they were described as librarians on acid, and it was the other one, insects with no vibe. And these guys were complete nerds and hated suburban middle-class America. And they went to an art school, found each other, and discovered that they had a mutual love for jazz and music of the 40s and 50s. And they got together and put together these songs. And they had no money, so they would go and cold call on the Manhattan recording establishment and say, would you like to hear our music? And without any answer, they would sit down on a piano that probably wasn't tuned and plunk out these really strange songs. And the record bosses would look and say, sorry, I don't get it, and I want you out. So they struggled mightily to eventually get that jewel called the recording contract, and they only got that many years later in Los Angeles, and they never looked back. But if there are any Steely Dan fans out there, high five. It's been a wonderful journey for me to discover that kind of music. But there they are as youngsters, looking as uncool as you possibly could imagine a rock and roll star to look. You know that Bruce Springsteen's real success came after his third album, and his first and second albums, just while critically acclaimed, didn't really make it. So in his second recording, he was actually sleeping on the beach. He had no money to his name, and he just believed that he had something that would eventually push him through. And so he and the band would sleep out on the beach. They lived in New Jersey, and they were recording in the day, and then at night they'd sleep, and that was it. And eventually they broke through. And Dylan as well. He chanced his arm. He just rocked up in New York, 1961, and started playing. And it took him, he had a lot of chutzpah. This is also the case that's never really understood. But he had to push and push and push. But initially, people didn't get it. This crowd of 52 people arrived. So fewer people than this audience, all right? And he got nothing, no takings whatsoever. Tom Waits, he says, it's amusing in retrospect. There were nights when it was like pulling teeth. The artist's business is merchandise. One night off in 2 weeks. The problem with performance is it's repetitive. Unless I can come up with something new each night, I find it's grueling. I'm just like a monkey on a stick. I know every flop house in every town. So this is what it's like, trying to break through, going onto the circuit and hoping that you can make it. 1959, Keith Richards drops out of school. My parents were brought up in the Depression. My dad was the most unambitious man in the world. Meanwhile, I was a kid and I didn't even know what ambition meant. I just felt the constraints. The society and everything I was growing up in was too small for me. Maybe it was just teenage testosterone and angst, but I had to look for a way out. I had big ideas, even though I had no idea how to put them into operation. I just felt that I was smart enough one way or another to wriggle out of the social net and playing the game. So there he is. He's got my book. Don McLean went through 34 label rejections before eventually signing with Media Artists in 1970. J.K. Rowling, I was the biggest failure I knew. If you know the story of her life, the next slide will talk a bit about it. But, she was young, single, divorced, a mother, and all she had was this sense of what she wanted to do, which came to her fully formed on a train that had been delayed into London. She had this huge idea, and that was the only currency she had. So it was a massive thing for her. And again, 12 publications before Bloomsbury eventually signed her off. I mean, if I was one of those editors that passed in it, you'd want to bite your arm off now, This is how it is, unfortunately. Failure meant a stripping away of the inessential. I began to direct all my energy into finishing the only work that mattered to me. I had really succeeded at anything else, but I might never have found the determination to succeed in the one area I believed I truly belonged. I was set free because my greatest fear had already been realized, and I was still alive, and I still had a daughter whom I adored, and I had an old typewriter and a big idea. And so rock bottom became the solid foundation on which I rebuilt my life. So that's how it was for her. Saying, I've got no other option. I've got to do it. Where else can I go? Bob Seger from the Silver Bullet Band, he was based in Detroit. And he was 5 years older than another Detroit singer, songwriter, a guy called Glenn Frey. And he became very famous with a group called the Eagles. And Bob Seger ended up giving advice to Glenn Frey because Glenn was he was a real shuckster. And Bob Seger said to him, says Glenn Frey related the story. Bob was the first guy who wrote his own songs and recorded them that I ever met. And he said, if you want to make it, you have to write your own songs. And I said, well, what if they're bad? And he said, well, they're going to be bad. So just keep writing and eventually you'll write a good song. And that is the resilience required to keep going when you are learning your craft. So Glenn Frey and the Eagles, the greatest ever selling album is not Thriller. It's the Eagles' greatest hits. It's the greatest selling album ever, full stop. And this is Glenn Frey talking about his buddy Bob Seger. I spoke about Richard Ford yesterday, but I want to give you the quote that he gave in full verbatim, because he spoke about what it requires to be an artist if you want to be an artist. Because the challenge, the requirement is everything. When I say you have to be yourself, there are no easy routes out of this thing. It requires everything, this authenticity project. So I love this quote. There he is. If they say, I'd like to try my hand at writing, yes, I would say give it a go. If they had that sort of tentativeness about it, I would say, sure, it's a victimless crime, go ahead. If someone else said, what I want to do more than anything else in the world is I want to be a novelist, I would say, well, why don't you try and talk yourself out of it first? Because you're probably going to fail. Then, if the person says to me, okay, I've done all that. I've listened to all you have to say. I've tried to talk myself out of it, but I really can't do it. Then I would say, go with God, young man. Go with God. And that really is how it has to be, because this is a project of self. It doesn't have money and fame and success attached to it. Those are not guaranteed. In fact, you're pretty much guaranteed not to get it if you look at the rate of failure of great artists, of any artists. We just see what's great. In the book, I talk about this thing about success and the role of luck. The role of luck is major. Imagine if J.K. Rowling had decided after the 12th rejection, that's it, I'm going to go and teach English in Korea. All right? That would be it. So how lucky was she to keep going? And imagine if she'd had 24 rejections. This is simply how the roll of the dice works. It's Darwinism, straight on. It's how the successful species keep going. And you don't know when your number's up. You don't. Let's look at integrity. So the definition that I got off the internet, artistic integrity means to create for the hell of it, not because you want profit. All right. So there are very, very few artists that are going to make a lot of money, or sometimes any money at all. But if you ask artists why they do it, they're not in it for the bucks. All right. That's the truth of it. They're in it because they have a project that they want to succeed at. So here is Henri Matisse, age 40. He goes into minimalism, puts on this exhibition. Critics were dismissively cruel, accused him of crude overindulgence, pig-headed befuddlement, skewered him for his inconsistency and lack of clear artistic vision. His biographer, Hilary Sperling, said, one after another they attributed their inability to make head or tail of what Matisse was doing to his shortcomings rather than their own. Attacks came from all quarters. The young and progressive were as splenetic as the elderly and conservative. But he moved through, he pushed on. And as you can see, those were the movements that he inspired and drove. Here is Ernest Hemingway. All right. A writer's problem does not change. It is always how to write truly, and having found out what is true, to project in such a way as it becomes part of the experience of the person who reads it. Critical to this task, and I love that quote, is a built-in shock-proof shit detector, and all good writers have it. All right. It's being able to see things for what they are, see the falsity, see the inconsistencies and the paradoxes, and being able to put your finger into that wound as required. So that's what he did. You mentioned Bob Dylan already. But, Paul Simon said for a while Bob Dylan defined the genre of the folk of the folk era. And these were the albums that he first produced, and he became so renowned for those, all right? So there's his girlfriend, Suze Rotolo, walking down, I think it's 52nd Street, but it's a frozen day. You can see that ice on the pavement. There is times that are changing. You grew up with these albums. You know them well, all right? I guess you know what's not going to happen, all right? But he was the voice of the civil rights movement. And people followed him. There's Joan Baez, who was so inspired from him. Wrote that song about taking a call from a booth in the Midwest. I don't know if you remember it, called Diamonds and Rust. But they were a great partnership while it lasted. And then, 65, 66, he goes electric. And there's this famous concert in Manchester where the first set was all nice and folky. And then halfway through the set, after the intermission, they plug in and go electrical. And this audience goes ballistic. they can't believe the cacophony that's assaulting them. And there's this famous line where somebody says, Judas calls him being a complete sellout. And there's this wonderful clip where he says, I don't believe you, you're a liar. And he instructs his band, he says, play it fucking loud. And it's one of the key moments where he swiveled into a new genre of music. And like a Rolling Stone, of Bringing It All Back Home, was one of, in fact, it is the greatest song ever written, according to Rolling Stone. And all of those songs are fantastic. And when I was a young lad of about 20, 21, I discovered that last album at the bottom there, Blonde on Blonde. And for me, that was like having the scales peeled away from my eyes. It was the most amazing epiphany. Seeing Memphis Blues again, that song just undid me. And reading, as I said, the No Direction Home biography on him. So he changed completely, and in fact he became chameleon-like because there were subsequent changes that came through as well. So in 1966 he has this freak motorbike accident, and he walks away from the electric space and all the fans as he accumulated then. He gets married, moves up to a farm in Woodstock, ends up cutting his hair, reading the Bible, taking art lessons. This really kind of homey kind of guy. Puts out this album in 1968, John Wesley Harding. And at the same time, you've got to bear in mind that the Beatles had put out Sgt. Pepper. So the psychedelic movement was going crazy. And he said, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go out. And, with the psychedelic movement, they spend months and months and months recording. So Dylan goes out to Nashville with his mates, and he decides he's just going to knock these songs out. He's not going to try too much. Because he fights against whatever the dominant current is. He says, I'm going to do it differently. And that's how he's just coded. So, you read that quote. So he just knocked them out like demos, and he'd laugh if there was like a little error in there. There's a song in there that he does with Johnny Cash called, do you know the one? Girl from the North Country. And in it you actually hear them mis-singing a verse. I think Johnny Cash starts the verse too soon. And they just put it out anyway. And that's kind of how it went. So this was for him the most truth that he could bring to his art. And he would go on later to produce, the greatest breakup album ever, which was Blood on the Tracks, 1975. And so it went. So he's just a fabulous example of staying true to your compass. But of course, then there's Neil Young. Neil Young, according to multiple sources, has never composed a song not stoned. All right? That's just how he operated as a composer. And we know that he's produced some of the greatest albums in the kind of West Coast folk genre that we grew up with. So in 1970, in fact, I watched this movie last night about this studio recording place in LA called Sound City. And Sound City was the place where he went and recorded. He just come out from Canada, and he recorded this wonderful album called After the Gold Rush. And in 1972, this multiple seller, Heart of Gold, went to #1, and so Harvest was huge. But he just became completely disillusioned with what was happening. He couldn't bear it. He's a loner by nature. He is depressive. He does suffer. And he just basically opted out. And songs like Heart of Gold put me in the middle of the road. Traveling there soon became a bore, so I headed for the ditch. A rougher ride, but I saw more interesting people there. That's what he did. Then what happens is it becomes even more interesting, because he then went on to produce some of his greatest albums. Not in this kind of hokey, countrified, relaxed format that became so popular and became mainstream pop music, but seriously pushed against the presiding norms of the time. So time fades away, that's so-so. But this particular album, On the Beach, is unbelievable because it's during the Watergate crisis. And it's just a completely disillusioned album. And in fact, it was so bad for Neil Young that he decided not to release subsequent takes on CD, and eventually he did, because it's acknowledged across all the critical formats that it's one of the best albums that he ever put out. In fact, one of the best of that decade. But then this one, Tonight's the Night. And what he would do is he just drank a lot of tequila. And he performed all his shows drunk, let's put it this way. But it was the progenitor of the punk movement. He would toy with the audience. So he would go out and say, "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Everything here is cheaper than it looks." He was completely distant from what was going on. And the crowd is expecting to hear Heart of Gold, all right, and Man Needs Made. And all he did was play the same songs off this album over and over again. He says, "And here's a song which I think you might recognize." And he'd play the same song again. And the crowd were just going ballistic. But he said for him, this was a new form of art that he was exploring. And today, it's kind of widely acknowledged that this is what was going on. So that's what set him up. And those two albums, if you're ever interested, are brilliant. Then what happens is he drifts into the 80s. And it gets really interesting because he puts out this really mediocre album. Everybody's rocking, lasting 25 minutes. That's how long the album was. And it was about kind of rockabilly kind of music. And Geffen Records, David Geffen, who ran the outfits, sued him for music that was not commercial and uncharacteristic of previous recordings. So Neil just dug in his heels. He says, "I'm not here to sell things. That's what other people do. You hired me to do what I do, not what you do. As long as people don't tell me what to do, there will be no problem." So he and David Geffen just dug in, and Geffen lost, of course, because Neil Young can produce whatever he wants to. He's Neil Young. That's how it is. And the recording bosses have to just get in line and do it as is required. So here's Bob Dylan talking about Neil Young. He says, "An artist like Neil always has the upper hand. It's the pop world that has to make adjustments. All the conventions of pop world are only temporary and carry no weight. It's basically two things that have nothing to do with each other." So all of these guys, these artists, know that this is what I'm doing. And they just don't waver. Bill Evans, "The market doesn't influence my thinking in the slightest. I know where I come from, where I am, and what I have to work with. And I try to make what I consider to be the most total kind of music and human statement within the means and tradition from where I come from." That's it. Just restating how these artists operate. "The distractions and seductions of fame and success, as I'd seen them displayed, felt dangerous to me and looked like fool's gold," said Bruce Springsteen in his biography. "I yearned for something more elegant, more graceful, and seemingly simpler. Of course, in the end, nobody gets away clean, and eventually I take my own enjoyment in fame's distractions and seductions, but not until I was sure I could handle them." And as I said, he didn't drink, and he hates coffee, by the way. Can't drink coffee. Doesn't drink alcohol. Doesn't smoke. No drugs. It's like a very different rock and roll style compared to, Neil Young. Here's my man, Donald Fagen. Great album, Nightfly in 1981. First album he produced when he split from Steely Dan. We always had an art for art's sake attitude towards the whole thing. Luckily, there was a time when our vision of what music we liked seemed to mesh with a lot of what other people in the population also liked. But that's no longer true. So they've moved on. But that's how they produced it. REM. Here's Michael Stipe, lead singer of REM. He says, when we signed with Warner Brothers in 1988, they knew they weren't going to get some easily manipulated, pre-packaged pop group. That was not going to happen. What they wanted was the integrity of what we had to offer. What they wanted was the kind of street cred or cachet that REM could bring to them, and the chance that we would give them a hit or two. And what happened was that we gave them a bunch of hits, and we became huge. So those are some of the stories around that. Let's move on to section 3, which is moral courage versus the state. And somebody said to me, well, aren't there any business types that are like artists? And I cited this guy, Steve Jobs, as being a case in point. Now, between creativity and civil conformity is the span. And your creativity diminishes as soon as you start moving towards conforming to what society requires of you. If you want to live your life in a creative way as an artist, you have to not look back too much, he said. You have to be willing to take whatever you've done and whoever you are and throw them away. The more the outside world tries to reinforce an image of you, the harder it is to continue to be an artist. Which is why a lot of times artists have to say, bye, I have to go. I'm going crazy and I'm getting out of here. That is Steve Jobs saying the same thing. So this question of leaders of outsiders and insiders, so these are great statesmen. All right, they were led by their conscience, not by the state. And they would not be dictated to by what state required of them. So again, it's a massive issue of sticking to your principles and having the courage to do so. Einstein was in fact offered prime ministership of Israel around the time of independence, and he turned it down for this very reason. Julian Bronowski, in The Ascent of Man, had a very prescient comment. He says, science, or knowledge, is a source of power that walks close to government and that the state wants to harness. If scientific knowledge allows itself to be commodified by organs of power, then faith in the role of knowledge and intellectual leadership will ultimately disintegrate under the weight of cynicism. State art, state music. It's as soon as it gets harnessed by the wrong forces, the integrity that the creative process generates collapses. So let's see some of these stories about how the wise sages deal with this problem.